Sometimes I forget to press the buttons and then we miss a little bit of it in one of them. Okay. So we'll get started in just a minute. I'm going to be presenting on, I'm going to start it with talking about voting today, and then we'll move on to actual scientific topics, although I think that being involved in policy, if you guys ever go in your careers into any industry or any government work as part of caring for the environment or doing anything with the EPA or the NIH or doing really anything at all that has to do with government, you'll find out how much policy really informs science and how much science and policy are sort of inextricably linked. So it's good to be involved in politics, or at least understand how politics is impacting science. All right, well, we'll get started. I have put this up already, but I'm going to share my screen, scoot things over. Come here. Here we go. Okay. All right. As you can see, I have titled this short presentation, Vote. So I wanted everyone to realize a few things about voting this year. It is a weird year, obviously. We are remote. And so voting is going to be a little bit different. Early voting starts next week in PG County and all over Maryland, okay? Some places have been early voting for a couple of weeks now. In Maryland, we only do early voting 1 week before, okay? I know that not everyone here in class is eligible to vote. And so this is more informational. If you are eligible to vote, but you haven't bothered to get involved or register or do anything else like that, I have information for you, okay? First, you need to find out if you're registered, okay? If you are registered to vote, then you can go to www.usa.gov, confirm voter registration. It will tell you where you are registered to vote currently. If you are not registered in the correct county or state, if you've moved recently, then potentially you are not going to be able to vote in the way that you'd like. So double check. You may have to go to a different county to vote, especially if you moved within Maryland, or go to DC to vote if you moved from DC. Move from a further way away, you may be out of luck for this election, but hopefully no one is going to be too disenfranchised there, okay? But do check your voter registration before you go and vote, okay? Now, it's past our actual registration time. 1 week ago, on October 13th, was the last day to register to vote officially. But if you haven't registered to vote, but you are eligible, a couple years ago, a law was put into place that said that you can vote provisionally, okay? Provisionally means that, well, your vote is going to be accepted, but only provisionally, because they have to check that you do live in Maryland, they have to check that you are eligible to vote, etc. You have to wait for them to vet things. Usually provisional votes are the last counted, but your vote will be counted nonetheless, okay? Just maybe a little bit after everything is called. So if you go to this place, elections.maryland.gov, voter registration, there is a link that shows you how you can vote, how you can register to vote in person at a voting center. But this is the basic concept. You go to the voting center with your driver's license or something else that proves that you live in the area. They will give you a provisional ballot. It's marked differently. It says provisional, and they're going to be looking at it and scrutinizing it with all of your information. You have to fill out some forms, but you can still vote. I don't want everyone to know this, okay? So if you are registered to vote and you are planning to vote, you have a couple of options. To vote by mail, you needed to have already requested a mail-in ballot, okay? If you've requested a mail-in ballot and you have it, mail it now. If you have not gotten your mail-in ballot, but you did request it, they aren't sending it automatically like they did in the primary. If you've requested a mail-in ballot, you need to mail it today. If you do not have it, then you can tell basically you can report that on the Maryland Vote website, which I'll link a couple times in here, and you can vote in person instead, okay? If you are registered to vote, you don't have to send your mail-in ballot in. You can tell them you never received it, and you can tell them what you're going to do, okay? It is recommended to mail it by literally today to guarantee it arrives on November 3rd. There's been a lot of stuff in the news about worries about post office and whether or not your vote will be counted even if you do it because of signatures, and you don't have the chance to fix your ballot if there's something wrong. So for all of these issues, I tell people, there are official drop boxes, okay? Make sure it is an official drop box. And you can drop it off at any time up until election day. And they will be collecting ballots from those boxes on election day, okay? You have to have it either in a drop box or it must be in the mail and arrive by November 3rd, which is why you have to mail it now to give it at least a week, okay? This link takes you to where are the official drop boxes across PG County. You may put them in any one in PG County, but if you're registered in PG County, you have to put it in a PG County one. If you instead live in Montgomery County or you live in, so if you live in Montgomery County or you live in DC or you live in Anne Arundel County, you do need to check your own county information for where those drop boxes are. But this is for Prince George's County. A lot of people do live in Prince George's County here, okay? All right. You can choose the choice that I and my husband will be choosing. That is to vote in person early or on November 3rd, okay? Some polling places are open early starting next week, Monday. Some are open on November 3rd, and some are open at both times. Make sure you check before you go. You need to know where the closest one is. The good news is that no one has an assigned polling place this year. Instead, no matter where you go in PG County, if you get to a polling place, you can immediately vote there, okay? Because there's not very many open, there's only going to be about 40. Normally, there'd be something like 400, okay? So there's definitely going to be a little bit more crowding if you go vote, which is why I recommend you don't vote on November 3rd. If you can vote earlier, please do. Okay. This link will take you to all of the locations that are open. So I'm going to go there actually when I show it to you. So this link tells you, again, it's going to tell you all of the locations. The early voting centers, the election day vote center locations. And again, there's some crossover here. Okay, so I live in Bowie. I'll be going to the Bowie Gymnasium. But maybe you live closer to the UMD, you'd go there. Maybe you live in Laurel. Maybe you live in Lanham, near to Largo. All of these are available for early voting, but make sure you know which ones are available for early and which ones aren't, okay? Like Bowie Bowie Gymnasium is open for election day as well, but not everyone is, so do double check where you're going. All right. Again, you can vote at any of these locations. If you live in Prince George's County, you are registered to vote. You have not voted by mail or requested a mail ballot, or you've told them that your mail ballot has not come and you plan to vote in person, then you may go to any of these. So no matter where you end up on a day that you feel like voting, you can go to any of these that are around, okay? If you don't live in PG County, the information in here is not going to be as accessible to you. You do need to vote in your own county in Maryland, okay? So look up your address and voting instructions at www.usa.gov/how-to-vote, and it will direct you how to get there, okay? So if you live in DC, you'll have to vote via the DC route. If you live in Maryland, you have to vote via the Maryland route, okay? Now, officially, I, as a professor, cannot offer you extra credit to vote. If any of your professors have offered you extra credit to vote, technically that's against the law, okay? I cannot tell you who to vote for. I cannot ask you to reveal who you are voting for, either in an assignment or through talking to you, okay? I cannot treat you differently or grade you differently if you tell me that you voted in a different way that I desired. Because as a professor, and just generally, I am not allowed to influence you. Well, I'm allowed to influence you. I'm not allowed to actually treat you differently or demand that you vote for someone, okay? There is a law that codifies this. Basically, it's if you are concerned about your grade, if you do not vote the way I want you to, or if I would give extra credit to those who vote and less credit to those who do not, then that is also not allowed, okay? I can state my opinion, okay? So, it is difficult to keep the words Trump and any of the policies that he has out of the way that I teach my class. I do try to teach in a very science-centered class. As a science professor, though, there are important items that are on the ballot via who you vote for, okay? Recognize that the approach to climate change is extremely different between candidates. And some candidates are more focused on the scientific approach and some are more focused on the economy approach, okay? Pollution regulation is another one, and we're going to be talking about pollution as we move into talking about climate change later this week and next week. Funding for scientific research policy, unfortunately, is inextricable from how we spend governmental money in order to solve environmental problems. How the EPA is treated, how the NIH is treated, how certain things are approached, okay? So recognize that you should, if you care about science, you should find out who is funding what kinds of scientific research as part of their moving forward. You know, if you care about the Space Force, then you may vote one way. If you care about funding for green energy, you may vote a different way, okay? One of the most important things that I believe is on the ballot is how important it is to have objective and non-political leadership and research on scientific topics. Oh. Dagnab. Okay, I'm back. I don't know what happened there. That might have been a Blackboard level 1. I think several people got disconnected. All right. You guys are back too. Good. Okay. There is an extreme importance of objective and non-political leadership and research on scientific topics, keeping medicine research, vaccine research, climate research, research on death rates from various cancer-causing elements, research on guns, research on human behavior. These things need to be objective, and they need to be not tied to political leadership. And so there's definitely been a shift in how science has been treated in some of this current administration. Again, if you believe that is going in the correct way, then of course you are free to vote in that way. I wish everyone to vote, even if you're voting differently than me. But understand that as a science professor, it is hard to extricate some of these concepts from the policy that exists today. So I strongly encourage everyone to vote and figure out what your main issues are and find out which of the candidates is on a path closest to you. I believe that voting and the candidates, you're never going to find a perfect candidate. But I've heard it as you're not going to marry the candidate. Instead, view the candidate that you are voting for as a bus, okay? This candidate is, if you've ever had to take a public transportation, sometimes if you get stuck somewhere, you don't just take one bus and get to one location. You take a bus that's going in the direction that you want. And then you get as close as you can to the destination that you wish. If the bus is going in the opposite direction of where you wish to go, you do not vote for that bus. So recognize that while there is no perfect candidate, and our politics are broken in many ways, that your vote can still impact positively the process of democracy in this country. Okay. That's all I have for voting. I posted this PowerPoint. It will stop being available after all the voting is said and done. Okay, so I am not going to keep this up and continue to talk about it, even if the election does not go the way that I wish. There's a lot of complexities here. And while I don't know the opinions of a lot of you guys, I know that science is extremely important to me, and science and policy are on the ballot. So, all right. Does anyone have questions about voting? And I presented this today because, today is the last day that you should be mailing your mail-in ballot, and today is 1 week. Yesterday is 1 week from the beginning of early voting. Because of the pandemic, if you're a voting person, I recommend that you go early. All right, that's all I have for that. We are going to start the second part of phylogeny, which is eons and extinctions. Okay, so we're going to be talking about that part. Oh, hold on, this is going to freak out for a second. But trying to start my slideshow. Silly thing. There we go. Okay. It's one of my favorite comics, actually. Save yourself, mammal. We will be talking about extinction events in this one, and we'll be talking a little bit about why certain organisms survived certain extinction level events and some did not. Okay. But in large part, this presentation today is very strongly linked to the presentation today is very strongly linked to what we're learning in Lab 10 about the progression of animal evolution and when certain traits became more common among animals, when different animal groups evolved, etc. Okay, so this links very well with Lab 10 and Lab 11 that we'll be discussing. Okay, so the title here, paleontology texts have changed a lot since dinosaurs took over the school board. So, anyways, so we're going to start out with talking about age of the Earth, age of life, okay? And how we represent when certain organisms lived or evolved, okay? The Earth itself is 4.6 billion years old. Life, very first life, we're talking about RNA, simplest prokaryotic cells, is 3.4 billion years old. Life did not immediately form as soon as the Earth did. That took a little while for that to build up. We talked a little bit about why that would happen. Okay. So we have eras and we have periods. Okay. Eras are the longest of the bunch. Okay. So we have the Precambrian era, So Hadean, Archaean, and Proterozoic. Okay, that describes really some of the pieces that are living in those areas. Okay, so we have these are eons, Precambrian and Phanerozoic. Okay, and then we have eras next to it. Okay, so these are the eras. Again, Precambrian is not included in this one, but Precambrian is basically when there was mostly protozoans, mostly non-eukaryotic, mostly single-celled organisms. Okay, there's very few Precambrian fossils. Who here has heard of or read any Lovecraft? I know it seems like I'm going off of talking about science, but I want to know if you guys have heard about Lovecraft. Okay, Jacob says, of course, I do hope that many of you have heard of Lovecraft. Lovecraft Country is it's a big deal. Okay, so Lovecraft, huge horror, amazing writer, terribly racist. It's always some troubles with people. He was incredibly racist. But I have some interesting, I just bought some books on Lovecraft, and he was actually, he was a very complex person, as people are. There are a lot of people, you know, Harry Potter is a fantastic book. J.K. Rowling has some issues, and so that's kind of how I approach Lovecraft as well. But Lovecraft overall, he had some interesting thoughts on, fossils, actually. So I recently read one of his works. It's about it's similar to Call of Cthulhu, but it is The Mountains of Madness. Okay, one of his longer works, really built up his mythology. In The Mountains of Madness, it basically represents biologists going to Antarctica to find these. Oh yeah, Mountains of Madness is fantastic. Okay, basically inspired The Thing, which is another fantastic horror movie. And so, but Mountains of Madness, one of the weird things that they had in the Mountains of Madness was this. They basically dug down into a certain area. They went into a cave, and they were finding. I'm getting back to the science right now. They found Precambrian fossils, and they were like, "Oh, this is where we are. We can figure out where we are in time based on the fossils." So they were finding very small Precambrian fossils, and they were like, "This is really old rock." But then below that rock were other fossils, larger, more complex fossils of organisms they'd never seen. So actually, as a biologist, that was reasonably creepy. Because I know that there's nothing that should be before the Precambrian, because life didn't exist on Earth before then, or it shouldn't have. So anyways, I'm telling you that you can get a better understanding of some old-timey horror if you understand how evolution works and how it should work. Anyways, thought that was a fun little addition there. Okay. Precambrian, though, is really the first fossils we ever find. This beginning of life, okay? The Hadean, Archaean, and Proterozoic. These were all movements. This is Proterozoic was right about when endosymbiosis happened, and you had some larger eukaryotic cells, but very small, okay? Then you get into the Cambrian period in the Paleozoic era, okay? Cambrian. So why do we divide things into Precambrian and then everything after Cambrian is a big deal? It's because of what happened in the Cambrian era, okay? So one of the key things here is that Precambrian, there was a lot of carbon dioxide on Earth. A lot of carbon dioxide coming from volcanic eruptions, coming from a bunch of things, okay? So there was no oxygen in the air, very little. Generally, the things that were alive were unicellular and they were anaerobic. the even as this is around the time again when the endosymbiosis happened. So you had protozoans, which were larger unicellular ones. Okay. So remember that life started, and about 3.6 years ago, and the Precambrian era went until about 542 million years ago. That's, in terms of how many years that is, that's a lot. Okay, a couple billion years. There was life, but it wasn't big or complex. Okay, now 542 million years to present, we go into what's called the Phanerozoic Eon. Okay, that's the eon we're in right now, and we have these larger eras: the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. We are currently in the Cenozoic era. Because of the explosion of photosynthetic bacteria and archaeans way back, as that built up, oxygen began to be released in the air. Respiration became possible, aerobic respiration, and multicellularity came about in the Cambrian era. As soon as multicellularity came about, a lot of stuff happened. Okay, life began to explode. Okay, so let's look. This shows you really the depth of time that this happened in. Okay, on the Hadean Eon, there was nothing, no life yet. Okay, origin of life happened in Archean Eon. The first life was formed. That's about when we start seeing these very microscopic fossils. Okay, there's soon after the origin of life, photosynthesis starts to happen. Okay, these are photosynthetic bacteria, still still prokaryotic, and so then a while later we have oxygenic photosynthesis. So before they were doing photosynthesis, it wasn't producing oxygen, and then eventually oxygenic photosynthesis starts to come about. Photosynthesis is now putting oxygen into the air. Okay, so now we have cyanobacteria. Okay, that's a very common bacteria that comes about. So this is now 25,000 or 2.5 billion years ago. That was the first cyanobacteria, and we start seeing evidence of oxygen in the atmosphere via rocks. The first eukaryotic cells happened somewhere around this time. They built up to enough where we could actually find fossils of them here. Okay, so eukaryotic fossils. Eukaryotic fossils, remember, that's because a larger cell engulfed a smaller cell and now has a mitochondria. And then we start finding photosynthetic eukaryotes where and this is the big branch, photosynthetic ones went this way. Eukaryotes that had to consume other organisms went the other way. And then we had the first red algae. One of the first, so multicellular life starts appearing right about here. Remember, multicellular life only became possible when present day oxygen levels started to build up. The oxygen levels we have here on Earth were very much lower in the early parts of the Precambrian. Okay, without oxygen, multicellularity is almost impossible because eukaryotic life was not able to process oxygen as fast. Really, eukaryotes only became possible when oxygen was more common. Okay, and they had to wait for oxygen photosynthesis to happen. Okay, so there's a lot that happened. So between the development of algae, which is the first multicellular organism, and the first sponges, now you have multicellular plants and multicellular animals. And the first bilaterally symmetric animals popped up right at the beginning of the Cambrian era. We are bilaterally symmetric. Okay, the first organisms were actually more radially symmetric, or with sponges, not symmetric at all. But note how little time has passed in comparison from the origin of life to the first sponges, first multicellular animal. There's a ton of time. 542 million years ago is really the start of multicellular life on Earth. And the start of the Cambrian era, when we start actually seeing an explosion of life. And really it's due to competition and predation. Remember, we talked about how predators and prey influence each other's evolution. And then evolution became sort of fast-tracked because now things are trying to eat each other, and things that are trying to that don't get eaten survive, and the ones that eat survive, and it goes back and forth. Okay, it's a huge explosion. So now we're looking at smaller levels of time. Okay, here's the Cambrian era. Arthropods, mollusks, vertebrates, and other phyla all popped up. We're learning about a lot of the phyla, and most of them popped up at the very beginning of the Cambrian era. And then complexity came after that. Okay? First seed plants, first tree plants, first bony fish, first vessels in plants, first mammals up here in the Triassic, first placental mammals in the Jurassic, first bee, first ant in the Cretaceous, then way up here, Homo sapiens. We're a pretty young species in comparison to a lot of animals. Okay? This shows you really the depth of time that has been at work in evolution. And so it's hard to think of these levels of time. It's hard to think about a billion years ago because we can barely figure that stuff out that has happened a couple thousand years ago. And so trying to figure out what's happened a billion years ago, well, that takes a lot of work and scientific study to figure out. A lot of this is fossil work. Okay. So we are in the Phanerozoic Eon, and then there's the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. Okay, we are in the Cenozoic era. Okay. Paleozoic. This was the beginning of the Cambrian, that diversification. Origin and diversification of animals, land plants, fungi. But note, 90% of the multicellular life dies at the end of that era. It's a lot of animals, a lot of organisms. So we're going to talk a little bit about what caused that and why we lost so much life at the end of the Paleozoic. The Mesozoic. Dinosaurs dominate. Gymnosperms, which are like giant coned ferns, dominate. We have fewer gymnosperms now. They are now, we mostly have flowering plants. Okay. And at the end of this era, another extinction event. Cenozoic, mammals dominate, land animals dominate, angiosperms dominate, angiosperms being flowering plants. Okay? So this is the pattern of movement of life. And it is not that there's no gymnosperms. We talked about how dinosaurs are really still around, but in the form of birds. But it's what kind of organisms were the dominant life forms and where. Okay? Happening amongst all of this is geology. Okay, so this is a really broad look at evolution. Way back in the beginning of the Paleozoic era, there was something called Gondwana, okay? And there was extensive ice on most of it. Oceans covered much of today's North America. There was a lot more aquatic life than there is now because there was less land. Then the supercontinent of Pangaea forms near the beginning of the Mesozoic. Okay? And Pangaea is a warm climate, can support a lot more reptile-like organisms. And the climate changes some, so from warm to now a more mild and temperate. And we start breaking up into our actual today's setup in the Cenozoic. Remember that all of these events of breaking up, coming together and breaking up, are all related to speciation. Remember we talked about the breaking up, and so this is widespread vicariance, causing organisms to be separated when they hadn't been separated before. Climate changing, certain climates are now different in different areas of the world, and now the ones that can adapt live and the ones that can't die. All these changes in the ocean and continent are still happening today, but they happen so slowly. In 1 billion years, the Earth will look very different. It's hard to predict how it will look because processes are so slow, okay? We know that some of these plates are larger than they used to be and some are smaller. Up here we have what's called the Juan de Fuca plate, okay? It is slowly moving into the edge of the North America plate, okay? And that's where a lot of, it's where Mount Shasta, one of the North American volcanoes is. That is where there's been a lot of earthquakes, and that's all because of geologic activity. Down south, these two plates moving together are the cause of things like Peruvian earthquakes, and tsunamis near Haiti, okay? There's a little hole in the Pacific plate that has formed the Hawaiian Islands. There's so anywhere where you see plates sticking together, that's where volcanoes, that's where volcanoes and earthquakes and geologic activity and upheaval and all sorts of stuff happens. Note the Pacific plate and the North American plate and the Philippine plate all come together right around Japan, where we also have a lot of earthquakes, okay? So this all tells you a little bit about some of the things that are shaping the pieces of this, okay? So yeah, you can have an idea of the direction that they're moving from, and you can piece some of these together. Now, some of them can't piece exactly. You can tell that the Africa and South American plate used to be smaller and more stuck together because they do actually fit together a little bit. Now, remember, erosion and other things, they aren't perfect puzzle pieces, okay? Rising and falling of oceans and other things have made it so that South America and Africa don't quite fit together exactly, but they do fit together some. And so there's a way to piece them together, and if you fill in the gaps, you have a puzzle that can fit together back into the early Pangea, okay? So this all kind of pieces together into the story of, well, why do certain organisms, are there different organisms in one area and different organisms in a different area? How long have they been apart? And how long have certain, when did this volcanic activity happen? And so that gives you a lot of ideas about that, okay? All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about species diversity, and this relates heavily to what we're talking about in Lab 10, okay? Evolutionary leaps led to an explosion in species number and diversity. There were certain evolutionary leaps that were bigger than others and faster. Remember that changing climate is a big deal. Changing all that shifting of continents, it's a big deal. It's causing a lot of vicariance, but also certain traits that come up, suddenly those are very beneficial traits, and becomes soon that everyone has that trait, okay? So the original speciation that happened that happened starting at the beginning of the Cambrian era is what's called adaptive radiation. Instead of having just a single branch, you have one ancestral species and a bunch of different offspring from just that one. This happened with the finches and mockingbirds of the Galapagos. One single organism landing on multiple islands, and each of those islands having a different requirement and different sets of those mockingbirds dying or living, okay? So that's adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation happens There are three hallmarks of how it happens. Okay, it's this radial evolution. There's a monophyletic group that starts out. You have a single species that is the literal parent of all of the rest of them. Okay, they all find their most common ancestor in this one species. Okay, it's speciated radially instead of just, well, one went this way, one went this way. It's several of them went several ways. Okay. All speciation happened from the ancestral to the new species. Okay. And then there's some speciation after in those branches, but the idea is that the radial part came from one species. It's not necessarily a slow change over time. All of these are happening at once. Every speciation event is occurring together at the same time. Generally, that's because of strong diversification in ecology. The finches and mockingbirds of the Galapagos Island, the reason why they speciated so rapidly, and they did this here, is because when the original finch came across the Galapagos, it found an empty environment. It found that on every place here, there were no birds that were like finches. They had an open space in front of them, okay? And because each of the environments could only support so many finches, each of them, depending on which island they landed on, where on the island they landed, certain of them would die and certain would survive. And they have what's called niche diversification. A niche is really what kind of things you're able to eat, how you're able to compete and interact with other organisms. So some of them became specialized in bugs, some became specialized in seeds, some became specialized in the top of the trees, some crawled up the side of the trees. And that's diversification because it's a completely open environment. You can fit anywhere you want. And so kind of like they're pioneers to a new place. This happens a lot on islands or tropical areas where there's abundant resources and not a lot of competition from other organisms. They have an empty slate. As an example for in terms of plants, there is so adaptive radiation happened in a specific kind of plant. Okay. There's something called a tarweed. It's this little itty bitty plant. And somehow tarweeds floated or were carried by birds across to the Hawaiian Islands. Hawaiian Islands came up via volcanoes. Nothing was living on them. There was no competition at all. And because of that, so 5.1 million years ago, Kauai came out of the ground, and there's a specific kind of tarweed on here that looks like this. Oahu, 3.7 million years ago, came up, and it's tarweed that now looks like a tree. In the younger ones, we have this certain types of species that can live on lava. This is important for younger islands because, well, they're mostly lava right now. In Maui and Hawaii, the most recent ones, there's something called the silver sword. I've gotten to see a silver sword in person in Hawaii, which is great. It's a fascinating species. There's nothing else like it. It has this silver base and these beautiful flowers that come up out of a stalk. And it dies after it puts out its flowers. It can live on really rocky, really unpalatable surfaces. And in other areas, there's this tree. None of these look very similar, but they all came from this tarweed. Wherever it landed and whenever it landed, it has diversified ecologically to fit the ecology of these specific locations. And that is adaptive radiation. So you can see here, tarweeds here, okay? These are the tarweeds on the mainland. These are what's called the outgroup, okay? So some tarweeds that stayed on the mainland. Here's a speciation event here. Here's a speciation event here. Kind of boring, right? You have a, oh, maybe something happened here to make one go this way and one go this way. But when the tarweed colonized Hawaii, you look at this radiation from the single one. 1, 2, 3, 4, instead of just this dichotomous branch. From that single one, there were 4 new lines born. Some of them turned into vines, and then the mats, and then the rosettes. And all of these, and some of those rosettes became the silver swords, which are very different than the matte versions of them or the vine versions. All from one little tarweed. It's because there was nothing on these islands at all. Some of the mats can live in very low nutrient areas by just getting basically nutrients from birds and from leaves. Those vines can grow in areas and kind of search around for nutrients. So these are fascinating plants. And again, this adaptive radiation happened because it came to an empty space. Nothing else was there. And so actually it's less beneficial for something that when you find an empty space to just fill up that space with one thing. The concept here is that because different parts of Hawaii require different techniques to survive, some of them that were vinier survived here, some of them that were matted survived here, some of them that were rosettes survived here. And now you have this huge diversification from only one single parent. And you look at these, they look nothing alike. And this is what happened in the Cambrian era, that huge explosion of diversity. The anolis lizard of the Caribbean is another one. When the lizards came over from the mainland, there's a lizard that lives in mainland Hawaii. It's very closely related to all the animals that are on the islands. And these animals, they came over to islands that had no other lizards, no other snakes, no other organisms to compete with them. And once they got there, there were so many habitats to live in. Some of them that had longer legs and thinner bodies decided to live in the trees. And some of them lived in the ground. And that became habitat specialization, and then reproductive isolation, and then speciation. All of them coming from one single species. Adaptive radiation. And the key here is it's because it's an empty ecological space where they don't have any other lizards to compete with. And so it's beneficial to them to colonize every part, but the ones that were living in different parts survive differently than the ones that are living in other parts. So what's interesting is that we talked a little bit about this in Lab 6, that sometimes a different mutation will happen. And so multiple mutations have led to dark fur, because dark fur is the phenotype that's chosen. So in Hispaniola, which is an island, a Caribbean island, there was colonization of the island by lizards that lived on trunks and crowns of trees. Okay? But because no other lizards lived in the area, some of them stayed trunk and crown, but others became the smaller ones. Well, they stayed on twigs. Others only lived on the ground. Others, the ones with longer legs are able to live on the ground, better lived on the ground, and this became now habitat isolation and speciation. Note that in Jamaica, ones living on twigs colonized Jamaica. But still, you find them dividing into trunk crown and trunk crown. You see the same forms coming from them because these traits are needed on these various things. They're called what's called ecomorphs. And those ecomorphs, those are the ones that are adapting specifically to the areas here. Okay, so the trunk and crown organisms, they're always going to have similar traits, even if they came from. So trunk and crown here did not colonize Jamaica, but there are organisms that are trunk and crown because all the individuals who live in the trunk and the crown have certain traits that are encouraged. Okay, this is kind of the concept of natural selection is not random. Okay, and all of this is sorting of already present traits. This is not a lot of mutation that's happening. So adaptive radiation is happening, and key traits become really unique things. The development of feathers was a big thing in dinosaurs and allowed certain sets of the dinosaurs to survive after that the meteorite crash. Okay, and the development of sexual organs in plants that allow the plant to hold on to these seeds. We'll talk about plant evolution next week. Okay, so you have the calyx and sepal and the petals. This development of flowers, that was a big deal. Before flowers were around, gymnosperms, which have no flowers, just let out seeds and pollen. And before the development of flowers, there was it remained a different way. But once flowers were formed, that they took over quickly because this is an innovation. All right. Again, the Cambrian explosion. I talked you through it a little bit. 3 billion years ago. Unicellular life. Early sponges, 635 million years ago, and all major groups that are now alive today were formed by 50 million years ago. I'm not going to go much through the fossil assemblages. That's not really the focus here. I just wanted you to understand the length of time. It took 2.5 billion years almost to go from unicellular to multicellular animals, and then only a half billion years to go from sponges to all the major groups. Again, there was this huge diversification of life. Okay, so here we have, I was mentioning those Precambrian fossils, and the fact that if you saw multicellular life underneath the Precambrian, you'd be very surprised. And this is why, is that after the Cambrian came, we have a ton of Cambrian fossils here. There's some Edicarian fossils and these microfossils. Again, these tiny sponges and corals that happened before, but very, very little. Okay, Cambrian is where we get the majority of the fossils from that. The Cambrian era. Cambrian fossils are large. They're diverse. For one thing, we have more of them because they have hard parts. Remember the fossil presentation from last week, that fossils themselves are more likely to form when there's hard parts, where hard parts evolved in the Cambrian era. Most phyla that we'll be learning about popped up in the Cambrian era itself. Edicarian fossils themselves are soft-bodied, so we don't have as many of them, and also they're less complex. The Cambrian explosion was triggered by several things, okay? More oxygen. Aerobic respiration is more efficient. If you're taking Bio 1130, you're learning about aerobic versus anaerobic respiration. And the key here is that it takes a lot more glucose. You have to process a lot more glucose to get the same amount of energy in anaerobic, no oxygen, than with oxygen respiration. Aerobic respiration is very efficient. Predation. Remember we talked about the influence that lynxes have on hares and the influence that hares have on lynxes. huge selection pressure by organisms preying on others. Okay, so you have this morphological divergence. New niches. Exploiting niches creates new niches, basically moving into new areas that we're not available for. Becoming land animals now. And moving on the land. Well, now there's no animals on the land. This adaptive radiation is happening all over the world. New genes, new bodies. So I'm going to mention another piece of media that I like. Has anyone watched Annihilation? Natalie Portman. One of my favorites. Okay. It's all right if you haven't watched it. James has watched it. In one of the parts, it talks about, so it shows these plants that are shaped like people. And one of the biologists in there, note that I seem to like biology horror. One of the biology people in there, she mentions, I bet if you checked that plant, it would have the Hox gene in it. That it would have the Hox gene from humans. The whole point is that everyone's genes were all mixing up. They were in some sort of like fractal spiral. Don't worry too much about it. But the concept here is that what if we took a Hox gene, this is the body parts gene, and put it into a plant? The idea would be that the plant would be shaped like a human because the Hox gene tells you about it's the home box of you. It tells you have 5 fingers on each hand, have five toes on each foot, have 4 limbs, okay? The more diversification you have in the Hox gene, the more complex you can be. Early organisms like sponges had no Hox gene diversification. Later ones had multiples because they had so many different body parts. Okay, larger and more complex bodies. So this shows you sponges, you had Hox like genes, but as so these boxes represent genes within the Hox cluster. Note that for sea anemones, which are part of the cnidarians, okay, you have a few of these. Okay, so these are genes within the cluster. They have tentacles and very simple bodies. You get to mollusks, and they're able to have tentacles, and they're able to have antennae, but also shells and digestive systems and multiple organs. You get to echinoderms and vertebrates, and we've got so much diversity and duplication in the Hox cluster. Mice and humans and other 4-legged animals, we have 4 clusters because we have 4 limbs, and some of them only have 1 or 2, and they don't have major like limbs kind of thing. Instead, fly is going to have so it has this 1 cluster, and that 1 cluster creates all of its legs. Okay. And the legs are all connected to a central nerve cluster. But this diversification of the Hox gene allowed for complexity overall across the entirety of their evolution. All right. We will talk briefly about mass extinctions and then come back to this on Thursday. Okay. There have been multiple mass extinctions in the history of this, okay? So this rapid extinction of lineages scattered throughout the tree of life. The definition here is that at least 60% of the species in the entire world are wiped out within 1 million years, okay? These are generally caused by catastrophic events. There have been 5 mass extinctions. We always talk about the asteroid, but there's been more than that, okay? So let's look at these. The biggest one here is, so we have the Cambrian era, and right at the end of the Permian era came this in-Permian extinction, the biggest extinction that we've seen. When you think of the one that happened 65 million years ago, killed off the dinosaurs. That's in Cretaceous. That's just the most recent one. But there was also a Triassic extinction, Devonian extinction, an Ordovician extinction. So there's been all of these different extinction events. But note, the Permian is much larger than anything else. Background extinctions happen all the time. Remember we talked about extinction as a big way of pushing forward evolution. But background extinctions happen all the time. And so some species live, some species die. Maybe there's a tidal wave, maybe there's an earthquake. But when over 60% of all organisms die, that's a big deal. Okay. So what's wrong with this picture? From what we've seen about all of how the events happen along the space, what's wrong with this picture? There's a caveman, he's fighting a dinosaur. We're going to talk about what happened during those extinction events. That's the next thing. Humans and dinosaurs didn't exist at the same time. If you look back here, humans came up near the Quaternary era. Dinosaurs died off in the Cretaceous. Okay, so we've never coexisted with dinosaurs. Yes, and James says the caveman has a terrible fighting stance, and he should have been trained better during this event. Okay. The key here is that background extinctions and mass extinctions differ. Normal environmental change, something smaller, can occur. So something like, let's say, COVID. It's not an extinction event. If it made an animal go extinct, it's not going to make humans go extinct. But if it made them go extinct, it would only make a small portion. Or it would make maybe a couple of species go extinct. Predation pressure can also cause that competition with other species. A lot of animals are going extinct right now because they're competing with humans. But a lot of this is still background extinction. Mass extinction is extraordinary, it's sudden, and it's a temporary change. It bounces back, okay? So let's talk about the biggest one we saw on there. The end Permian extinction happened after the Cambrian era. 90% of all species alive at that point died during the Permian extinction. We only have 10%. All the diversity we have today is from 10% of the life that existed back in the Permian era. Permian Eon era. So, what do you think caused it? I'm going to show you what caused it, but tell me what you think caused it. Any ideas? It wasn't an asteroid. What else could have caused it? Climate change did partly cause it. Jesse wants me to go back to the picture. Hold on. Here we go. Cambrian era that we've been talking about here. Move up. Okay, we're now in the Carboniferous Permian. Permian happened before Triassic and Jurassic, which are the main dinosaur eras. Cretaceous was the end of the dinosaur period, and when the big meteor hit. Okay. But so we're at Permian. Okay. 90% of all life died before things like the dinosaurs started to pop up. Okay. All right. So we have climate change. In part, yes, but due to a different event. Basically, climate change happened because a different event happened. Anthony says volcanic eruptions. Good idea there. It wasn't just one volcanic eruption, though. It was more than one. Low oxygen levels. Yes, Jacob, low oxygen levels did cause it. But again, it was built on some volcanic eruptions. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Disease was not really part of this. It was a changing in basically the livability of Earth. This is an artist's rendition of what it might have looked like. It was basically this huge eruption. It was these lines of volcanoes that popped up out of the earth very suddenly, very quickly. It filled the everything with smoke. The toxic gases that came out poisoned the water, poisoned the air. Very little of the earth was very suddenly suddenly most of the earth was unlivable. Water became very low in oxygen. The oxygen levels that had built up were choked out by the large amounts of toxic gases. And so only the ones that were able to survive this very intense extinction event, well, they were the ones who were able to give back. And remember, volcanoes cause great fossils, so we're able to see a lot of what lived back then because they were preserved in these huge things, okay? So these flood basalts, they're called Siberian traps. Heat, carbon dioxide, and sulfur dioxide all built up there and basically exploded out in these lines of volcanoes. Atmospheric CO2 from the volcanoes trapped the heat. They had very sudden and intense climate change. Oceans stratified. Low oxygen near the top. Deeper areas had oxygen, but there was H2SO4, basically sulfuric acid in the deep ocean. Oceans become a lot less livable. Oceans become largely anoxic. Things that live in the ocean need air to breathe. This was part of actually the push to make the primary animals, land animals, marine animals were very common before. Sea level dropped, making less habitat in the sea as well. And again, more habitat on land, so ones that could live on land survived better. There was low oxygen and high CO2 levels, but terrestrial animals were restricted to very small areas that were livable and breathable. And then the aliens came and they took away most of the rest of the animals. Because of it was a very extreme event. Okay, so the low oxygen volcanic eruptions were the main thing, and the volcanic eruptions opened up these Siberian traps that let out tons of heat and carbon dioxide and SO2. All that CO2 caused climate change. All of that also impacted oxygen levels, and the sea level changed, and oxygen became limited, and a very intense event. And this is why we have a lot more land animals now, and this is why sea animals actually became extinct rather fast. We do have sea animals today, but there's less of them than there used to be, in large part because of the Permian extinction. All right. Now, of course, I've been talking about this for a little bit. Who can tell me what killed the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous 66 million years ago? It's on the first slide. A lot of things. Sure, but what specific event caused it? It was a rock from space. It was an asteroid, okay? Impact hypothesis. The extinction of dinosaurs proposes an asteroid struck Earth 65 million years ago, okay? Between somewhere in the range of 65, 66, okay? This was a smaller extinction, but 60 to 80% of all multicellular species alive died. So this is showing how big it is. Okay, so it hit in the Yucatan Peninsula, all right? So here is modern day Belize, the Yucatan Peninsula for Mexico, okay? It hit in the Gulf of Mexico area, and things have moved around since then. It was huge in comparison. Yes, it likely was that big. We have evidence for the impact hypothesis. As I mentioned, there's a lot of evidence. It did create a crater, Luis. Yes. So how did the Earth repopulate? Well, things that lived further away, lived better. And so what this did is it caused huge amounts of climate change. Dust went up into the air. It changed the climate to be cooler. You know what survives better in cooler environments? Mammals, not reptile-like organisms. Okay, so there was a big deal here. They're not fully sure why dinosaurs didn't survive as well. But larger bodied land animals like dinosaurs did not do well. Smaller ones with feathers and more warm-blooded ones, like bird-like ones, survived. Okay, mammals survived because they were smaller. They had and they were able to stay warm in the colder environment. It was a artificial ice age. So we have evidence showing the spike of iridium in the 66 million year old rocks. Iridium's super rare on Earth. It's abundant in asteroids. Basically, the asteroid, when it hit, it vaporized and spread iridium all over the Earth. We find it now in 65 million year old rock. 66 million year old rock. Also, especially around the Gulf of Mexico, we find a spike of shocked quartz. Shocked quartz is rare as well. It occurs under extremely high pressures, like from events like impacts. It's not created in volcanoes. So something created a big impact and a bunch of smaller impacts because basically it exploded when it hit. We also find a spike of microtectites in 66 million year old rocks in the Gulf of Mexico. These specific little glass droplets, they form only under extremely high temperatures. How would there be high temperatures? It wasn't from a volcano. Molten rock is splashed. There's so much of it because basically when the giant asteroid hit, it partly vaporized, partly exploded, and partly melted because it was such a big impact. And of course, there's the crater. Yes, there is a huge 66 million year old crater. Okay, so it shows it as larger in the picture before. Okay, so the picture was a little bit dramatic. Okay, maybe, but literally, it was probably more like half that size. Okay, it's still really big. Okay, there's a massive crater, 180 kilometers in diameter. That's big, okay? People have talked about this asteroid that has been seen coming close to Earth. And it's about 5 miles in diameter. Wouldn't actually hurt anything. People were all worried, like, oh, well, if it hits, then it could make an explosion, whatever. Other asteroids and meteors have hit Earth before. This is one of the biggest. We would not miss this coming, okay? We would see it coming from a long way away. And if we missed one coming, it would be something that could level a city, not destroy the planet, basically, okay? So this was a almost planet-destroying asteroid. 180 kilometers in diameter, an impact of this size had wide-ranging effects across the entirety of the world because of all that vapor and all of that. And basically it created an artificial ice age because it blocked out the sun. And so climate change and of course everything right there was vaporized too, but huge wide-ranging effects. 6 miles across, it would have created a huge fireball, which would create wildfires, giant tsunami, acid rain that came down afterwards, killing plants, and dust and soot, and the overall impact being global cooling. In large part, a lot of things that were cold-blooded that weren't ocean-dwelling died out. Dinosaurs. The dinosaurs that were, so there was a range of cold to warm-blooded. The smaller dinosaurs that were warm-blooded survived and became birds. All right, that's all I have for today. I know, asteroid and such. This is actually one of the more interesting pieces of things that I am talking about. There was a creator, a giant rock, an asteroid. You guys all know about this extinction event. We learned about a different extinction event before, okay? Should be able to tell me a little bit about some of the evidence that we have about the asteroid hitting, when the largest extinction event happened, why it happened, and some of the reasons why the Cambrian explosion happened. Okay, so those are the concepts that you'll be tested on in the future. That's all I have. I do have office hours today from 1 to 3. If you are interested in asking more questions about the quiz itself is due on Thursday. I'm sorry if I scared anyone. I think I said due on Thursday. Due today, I meant available to take today. You should all be able to see it because everyone has taken the honor pledge. The honor pledge does apply to that. Remember, it is open book, but only physical book, physical notes, no digital notes or digital books allowed. Okay, so you'll have to make notes on everything that was part of it. All right. That's all I have for now. Does anyone have questions right now? Again, due on Thursday, lab quiz 3. Okay. Due on Thursday, lab quiz 3, Faith. That's what I just said. Okay. So I sent out a notice about it. We don't have a quiz right now for lecture. I think it may be on our schedule. I will be delaying that until next week. Okay. We have a lot to deal with right now, so I'm going to delay that until next week, and we will have the lab exam next week. Okay. Great. I will see everyone on Thursday, or make an appointment with me, or come to my office hours today and tomorrow. There's a lot to do. This is a majors class. There's a lot to do on a regular thing. Angela has a question about the journal assignment. Is it a general question or about your journal assignment? Okay. Why don't you send me an email about it, and then I can answer it directly. Or if you'd like, you can come to my office hours and we can talk if no one else is around at that point, okay? All right, thanks. All right, well, I'm going to turn everything off here.